It's one of the most famous stories that Jesus ever told. Even people who don't read the Bible know the outline. A younger son demands his inheritance, leaves home, wastes everything, ends up feeding pigs, and then comes crawling back to a father who welcomes him with open arms. We call it the parable of the prodigal son. And that title makes sense, at least on the surface. The word prodigal means wasteful, reckless, extravagant. The younger son certainly qualifies. He burns through everything that he has and nearly destroys himself in the process. But what if the title is already pushing us in the wrong direction? What if the story isn't mainly about the son who left? What if the real point of the parable is not the obvious sinner who runs from home, but the deeper, harder to see lostness of the son who stays? Because when you slow down and read this story in its setting with first century ears, the parable starts doing something much more unsettling than most of us expect. It turns out this is not just a story about one lost son. It's a story about two. And the son who never left and went to a far country may be the one in the greater danger. That's the first thing to notice. Jesus does not tell this story in a vacuum. Luke 15 opens with a scene. Tax collectors and sinners are coming near to hear Jesus, and the Pharisees and scribes are grumbling. Their complaint's simple. This man receives sinners and eats with them. That is not a throwaway detail. That is the engine of the whole chapter. In that world, to eat with someone is not just sharing calories. It's to share fellowship. It was a public act of welcome, a gesture of acceptance. The religious leaders are scandalized because Jesus isn't just preaching to sinners, he's receiving them. So Jesus answers their complaint with three parables in a row. First, a shepherd goes after one lost sheep. Then a woman searches for one lost coin. Then comes the third story. Not one lost sheep, not one lost coin, but a lost son. Or rather, two lost sons. That progression matters. The first two stories train you to expect a pattern. Something is lost, then found, and then there's joy. But the third story complicates the pattern because by the end, one son is found and the other is still outside. One is restored openly and the other is standing near the house, but far from the Father's heart. That's the shock that Jesus is building toward. The story begins with a line that modern readers can miss because it sounds almost ordinary to us. The younger son says, "Father, give me the share of the estate that falls on me." That sounds rude, maybe even immature, maybe greedy. But in the first century world, it's more than that. This is not a harmless request for an advance. It was effectively a relational rupture. It was the son saying, "I want what belongs to me, but I don't want you." The inheritance only comes after the father's death. So to demand it early is, in effect, to treat the father as if he were already dead. And then comes the next surprise. The father agrees. Luke says he divided his property between them. But the Greek word used here is bios. It can mean property, yes, but more literally, it means life. The father divides up his life. What the son is asking for is not just cash. He's tearing into the fabric of the family itself. And then the younger son liquidates it. Not many days later, Jesus says he gathered everything and went into a distant country. That means he probably sold off land, inheritance, family assets. In the ancient world, land was not just real estate. It was a memory. It was identity. It was family continuity. This son is not simply moving away. He's cashing out his familial belonging. Then he wastes it all in what the text calls reckless living. And soon enough, the fantasy collapses. It always does. A famine hits. The money is gone. The friends disappear, and the son ends up hiring himself out to feed pigs. For a Jewish audience, that detail lands with force. This is not just poverty. This is degradation. He's now living among unclean animals, starving so badly that pig food starts to look appealing. And then comes one of the most important lines in the parable. He came to himself. That is such a strange phrase. Jesus could have said he repented. He could have said he regretted his choices. He could have said he remembered the truth. Instead, he says the Son came to himself, which suggests that sin had become a kind of exile from his own true identity. He has been living outside of reality, outside of sonship, outside of his right mind. And in the pigsty, with nothing left to prop up the illusion, reality finally catches up to him. And what is the reality that he remembers? Not his father's strictness, his father's goodness. How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare? That's the turning point. He remembers abundance in his father's house. But even now, he does not yet understand grace. He begins rehearsing a speech. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. Notice what he's doing. He's still thinking transactionally. He thinks he can return not into relationship, but into arrangement. He has no category for restoration. The best he can imagine is employment. He assumes that sin has permanently reduced him from son to servant. And if we are honest, that's how a lot of people still think about God. We imagine that after enough failure, the best we can hope for is tolerated existence. Maybe God will let us hang around the edges. Maybe he will allow us to be useful. But surely full restoration is not in the cards. That's exactly the logic that Jesus now explodes. Because the son gets up and starts the long journey home. And Jesus says, while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. See, every phrase matters there. The father saw him, which implies he was looking. The father felt compassion. The Greek verb is a word for deep, visceral mercy, the kind that you feel deep in your soul. And then, most shocking of all, the father ran. A patriarch in that culture didn't run. It was undignified. To run, he would have had to gather his robe, expose his legs, and sprint publicly down the road. It's an image of abandoned dignity. The father is willing to be seen in a way honorable men were not normally seen. Why? Because love has outrun propriety. The son starts his speech. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. And he never gets to finish. He never reaches the line about becoming a hired servant. The father cuts him off. Not because confession doesn't matter, but because the father is already moving faster than the son's categories can keep up with. He calls for the best robe, a ring, and sandals. Those are not random gifts. The robe is honor, the ring is family authority, and the sandals mark him as a free member of the household, not a barefoot servant. The father is not merely forgiving the son internally, he is publicly restoring him. He is dismantling his shame piece by piece. Then the party begins. The fattened calf is killed. Music fills the house, and the father says the line that interprets the whole scene. This my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. That is the joy of God, not a reluctant acceptance, not probation, not cold religious tolerance. Joy, explosive joy, the kind that scandalizes people who still think that love should be distributed according to merit. And if the story ended there, it would already be beautiful. But Jesus isn't finished Because the parable is not really aimed at the younger son. It's aimed at the people who are offended by the father's joy. And so Jesus introduces the older brother. He's in the field, he hears the music, and he asks what is happening. And when he learns that his brother has returned and that the father has welcomed him with celebration, he becomes angry and refuses to go in. Now, the real target of the parable comes into focus. The Pharisees complained that Jesus was eating with sinners, and now here is a son refusing to enter the celebration because grace has been shown to the undeserving. He is the mirror image of the religious leaders. And just as the father went out to meet the younger son, now he goes out again, this time to plead with the older one. That alone is worth noticing. The father leaves the party for both sons. He goes out into the far country for one, and he goes into the field of resentment for the other. Grace seeks both forms of lostness. The older son's speech is revealing. Look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command. The word translated, it means to serve as a slave. That is the tragedy. The younger son wanted the father's wealth without the father. The older son wanted the father's approval without ever really loving the father himself. He has lived in the house, but not in freedom. He has obeyed, but his obedience has been transactional. He is keeping score. He's not speaking the language of sonship. He is speaking the language of merit. And then he says, you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. Do you hear the sadness in that? Not that I might celebrate with you, but with my friends. The father's house has become for him a place of labor, not delight. He has proximity without intimacy. He has nearness without joy. And then comes the harshest line, this son of yours. He cannot even say my brother. His righteousness has made him loveless. That is one of the deepest insights of the parable. One rebellion makes a person visibly lost. Self-righteousness can make a person invisibly lost. And often, the second condition is harder to heal because it can disguise itself as virtue. The younger son knows he's broken. The older son thinks he's owed. One is starving in a pigsty. The other is starving in the father's house. And then the father speaks, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. The word there is tender. Not the formal word for son, but more like child. The father answers anger with gentleness. And in that sentence, he reveals the older brother's tragedy. Everything has already been available to him. The presence, the relationship, the inheritance, the joy of the house. But he has lived as if the whole thing were a contract. He's been trying to earn what he already had access to. That is religion at its worst. Not obedience flowing from love, but obedience weaponized into entitlement. Not holiness, but moral bookkeeping. Not gratitude, but grievance. And then the father says, it was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. Notice the correction. The older brother says, this son of yours. The father says, this your brother. Grace is not only restoring the younger son, it's inviting the older son to become human again, to re-enter relationship, to let joy replace resentment. And then the parable ends. No resolution, no final scene, no statement of whether the older brother goes in. Jesus leaves the story hanging because the real older brothers are standing right in front of him. The Pharisees are the unanswered ending. Will they come in? Will they join the joy of heaven? Will they accept a kingdom where sinners are welcomed before they have time to impress anyone? Or will they remain outside, clinging to their moral record like a receipt they expect God to honor? That is why this parable is so penetrating. It redefines what it means to be lost. We usually imagine lostness as obvious rebellion. The younger brother fits that picture perfectly. He is the one everyone would point to and say, there is the sinner. But Jesus says there is another way to be lost. You can be lost through control, lost through comparison, lost through merit, lost through resentment at grace, lost while saying all the right things and staying in the right places. You can be far from the Father in a distant country, or you can be far from the Father standing right outside his door. That is the terrifying brilliance of this story. The opposite of the younger brother is not the older brother. The opposite of both brothers is the father. One son is bad and he knows it. The other son is good and weaponizes it. But the father moves toward both with costly love. That is the center of the parable. Not just the prodigal son, the prodigal love of the father. A love so extravagant it runs down roads and leaves banquets to plead with bitter men. A love so free it restores the disgraced and confronts the self-righteous. A love that will not be managed by our moral categories. Maybe the best image for this parable is a house with two locked doors. One son locks himself out from the outside through rebellion. The other locks himself out from the inside through resentment. One says, I don't want the Father. The other says, I want the Father to reward me properly. Both are forms of alienation. Both refuse the simple joy of being loved. And the Father keeps moving toward both doors. So what does the parable of the prodigal son actually mean? It means sin is deeper than bad behavior. It means grace is more offensive than most religious people realize. It means you can reject God by breaking his commands, and you can also reject him by trying to use your obedience to put him in your debt. It means the heart of God is not revealed in cold distance, but in costly welcome. It means the real question hanging over every listener is not which brother's worse. The real question is, will I come into the feast? Will I lay down my rebellion? Will I lay down my scorekeeping? Will I stop trying to negotiate servant status or demand employee wages from the Father? Will I let grace make me a son? Because in the end, the parable is not mainly about morality. It is about whether we want the Father himself. And Jesus tells it because that is exactly what the kingdom offers. Not just forgiveness, not just a second chance, not just improved behavior. The Father himself, the house, the feast, the music, the embrace, the impossible joy of being welcomed home. That is what the parable of the prodigal son actually means. Two lost sons, one searching father, and a grace so scandalous that the only people who cannot enjoy it are the ones who are still trying to earn it. If you appreciated this, let me know down below what else you want to hear me cover. And remember, keep us in your prayers. God bless.